Okay, so this is I am Justice Williams, and we're gonna look at a couple of tools to help us in the end game phase of the game here. And the end game we're gonna be looking at today is how to defend a pawn down rook end game here. All right, so we're gonna start with knight takes g4, pawn takes g4, and now we have a rook end game. Right, rook versus pawns. Right, and the one probably the most important thing you need to do in an end game, whether you're defending or you're trying to convert a winning advantage, is activity, right? Activity of your king and activity of your pieces. So white plays the move king h2, which makes a lot of sense here because the other moves, such as rook d1, even though the computer sort of likes this move, is hard for a human to really like this move because after g3, our king is locked in the bind here. We can't go to h2, we can't go to f2, right? So that's done. That's done with, right? And if we take the pawn right away, now we fall into rook c1, right? And our king just can't escape. So rook d1, rook takes d1, and that's mate, right? So what if we move the king first? Well, if we move the king first, we're still in some trouble here because after rook c2, black is stopping our king from further getting out while also threatening some pawns. So now let's say we take here, right? We trade pawns because one thing you want to do in endgames is trade pawns, right? That helps the game get closer and closer to a draw, right? Instead of taking the pawn right away, black can play rook f2 first, forcing the king to decide where it needs to go or wants to go. Let's say it goes to e1. Right now, rook takes a2, gets the pawn back, but more importantly, black is still threatening to take this pawn here. Right, so that is going to be a problem. And now if we decide to defend it, well, we're going to lose another pawn. And why are we even playing this now? Why are we even playing this now? So this can't happen. Let's say instead we went to g1. Right? It defends the g2 pawn, but it still leaves us in a worse and losing position after rook takes a2 because the same threat of rook a1 mate is here. Right? So the king needs to be active, right? Because if the king is not active, we're liable to be in trouble here. So after king h2, king f7, right? Now black is also trying to activate the king, as they should. Rook d1 now, king e6. And now the next step of trying to defend these pawn down endgames is to really show that there's no progress being made, right? You can't allow your opponent to make progress in the position, right? You got to do anything in your power to not allow that to happen. So white plays the move rook e1. Interesting because now it's forcing the king to either part ways from the pawn or protect the pawn, but also leave these pawns h6 and g4 under attack here, right? Plus, we get to push our f pawn as well, which also does create some advantage or some chances for us as well. So after rook e1, black plays the move king f6, and now rook d1, showing that there's no progress, right? Because if black plays the move king f5, rook takes d5, where white should be happy with this, just because it's showing that there isn't too much progress to be made here, right? Start attacking some pawns, blah blah blah, right? So the more trades of pawns, the better it is for the draw for the losing side. So instead of king f5, black plays king e6. Black plays the move king e6, rook e1, showing that there is no progress. And so now it's on black to do more to try to win this position. So they give up the d5 pawn, right? So they trade one pair of pawns. Pretty good. Trading one pair of pawns, so 35, rook c1. Rook c1 is a mistake, but it's very complicated. The computer decides that moves like a6 and just start, getting your pawns sort of out of danger here is probably black's best move here to keep their advantage. But rook c1 looks normal enough, so we're just gonna leave it here. Right, rook c1 comes with a pretty big threat, right? The threat of g3 and rook h1 mate is on the board. So black white cannot allow that to happen, and white plays the move rook d4. Right, and after rook d4, king f5, rook d4, excusez-moi, king g5. Now this move is pretty important, right? Because after rook d5, black decides to go back to f4. But another part of defending endgames is finding tactical resources here, right? And after the move king h4, which looks pretty cool, right, g3 is actually made. So using the tactics in the position to your benefit will help you defend a lot of endgames here. So after king f4, rook d4 once again, king f5. Now king g3, king activity. King activity is necessary to stay in an endgame, especially when you're losing. King g3, and now rook c2. Rook c2 attacking this a2 pawn here. Also stopping rook takes g4, because not only can black take on a2, but more importantly, black can take on g2, forcing the trade of rooks. And now this is just going to be a completely winning endgame, because black is going to use this h pawn as a distraction, and that time used will be spent on bringing the king over to the queen side and gobbling up these pawns here. So what does that look like? Here, 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 bow, 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 bow. And these pawns are just gonna roll, or this pawn is gonna roll at least. And that's all that matters. That's the difference in the game here. So after rook c2, rook f4 was played. Makes a lot of sense. And now king e5, right? So we've managed to untie this king from this pawn, because if the king had went to g5, well, we play rook takes g4 with check, and now we're not a pawn down anymore. In this position, it's okay to play for white. So after king e5, white plays the move rook takes g4. Big mistake, right? You don't want to be too hasty here, especially when you're defending. You don't want to be too hasty, but you want to be able to stay composed and play a move such as rook f7, or the move rook to b4. Rook f7 is probably the best of the moves because it's forcing trades of pawns here. You want to force trades of pawns. The more pawns that get traded, the easier it becomes for you to draw out the game. So after rook takes here, right? We see there's a couple of pawns here that just are very loose here, right? If h5 ever happens, rook b5 is always a response. Plus, this g4 pawn is still under attack, right? So it's hard for black to even defend this pawn, right? Because you can't defend it with the king, because you will be checked. You will be checked at some point, right? So rook b5 is a check here. That makes a lot of sense. So the more trades of pawns, the better. And so after rook takes g4, and also rook b4 is also working here, or not rook b4 right away. Let's say rook a4. I like rook a4, a6, and now rook b4. Because now b5, we force to trade the pawns by playing moves like a4. Right, and if you play pawn 6, rook takes, and now we're attacking two pawns at the same time. We're going to take the a6 pawn first, but if you defend your a6 pawn, well, we'll just take this pawn, and now we're even again. And the draw is definitely in view. So after rook takes g4, now white actually throws away the draw here, because after rook takes a2, this weak b3 pawn is going to be the biggest difference in the game. But let's go further into rook f7 for a second. So rook f7 takes, and let's say black decides to chase after his b3 pawn, right? What does that look like? So let's say a5 was played here. Let's say a5 is played here. And then after rook b6, attacking this pawn, because like we said, after h5, we just play rook to we play rook to b5, and we're going to take that pawn that way. So let's say they just play king d4 right away. Takes, And now king c3. Let's protect our pawn. Remember, we're equal now. The pawn on g4 is still under attack, but we can't take it yet with the king because then g2 is the g2 pawn is hanging as well. So now let's say they play a move such as rook a3. Right, rook b2 won't work here. It might work here. It just might work here. So what would happen after rook b2? After rook b2, we can't play rook b5. Or can we? No, I don't like it. So let's say takes. I don't like that either. So rook b5 might lose to rook takes b3. Rook takes here, and now this move king b4 check. Now attacking the rook and also unleashing this rook check here. So that might be a problem here. So now let's see what the computer wants to say. So it likes this anyway. It likes rook a6 right now. That makes sense. Because now if rook takes b3, the rook is no longer attacking g2, and now we get to take on g4. And the main point of this endgame is that, yes, you're going to be able to push your pawn down the board, but will it be enough is the real question. So after a move like king f4, a4, g4, a3, g5, bow, 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 bow. And this might even be white is able to play moves like rook b6, but it might not be necessary. That might be very, very dangerous. But the point being that at some point we'll be able to get to sacrifice our rook for the pawn. And since the black king is so far away, black is gonna have to do the exact same thing or give a perpetual check to stop the promotion, right? So that would be the drawing idea here. But instead, white played the move rook takes g4, and after rook takes a2, these two pawns are gonna be too much, right? In the endgame that we saw here, this bad boy right here, there was one pawn that we had to deal with. Cool, we can sacrifice a rook for one pawn, but we can't sacrifice a rook for two pawns. And so after rook takes a2, how did this game finish up? Rook g7, g5, king h4, king d4, king h5, king c3, rook g3, king b4, king takes h6, a5. So now the only way white is able to make progress here is to push the g pawn, and to do so, then we need to get the rook out the way. So that's white's next task, is to get the rook out the way. So they play king h5, bringing the king backwards. And so after rook a3, rook f3, and rook trade, the rook trade here actually should not work because if we look, the queen square is on the same diagonal as our king. So, or the black king. So after a4, g5, a3, g6, a2, g7, black queens first, but white queens with check. And this usually smells like perpetual check at some point, because the queen just has so many open lines to be able to throw a check at the black king. So that wouldn't work here, right? Taking the pawn right away does not work here. So let's say that after rook f3, we can't play rook takes b3, but black plays the move a4. And now this is way, way, way different, right? If rook check, king takes, and now it's two pawns. Like, it's just two connected pass pawns, and that's going to be enough here to end the game. But after a4, if pawn takes a4, if you notice, the queen square shouldn't really matter here. After f4, a3, f5, a2, f6, queen. white is queen, black is queening first, and if you push f7, we can easily stop the queen. But if you decide to bring your king closer, well, we're gonna bring our king closer as well. Bow, stop all of it. King can't get in, pawn can't promote. Smells like trouble here. And so after a4, black won the game because white resigns here. And just to show you the tools that we need to be able to defend these kind of positions, right? It can get out of hand pretty quickly, right? Black can be winning, then the game can be drawn, and then black can be winning again, right? So if you want to be able to save these half a points, right, you need to use these tools, right? King activity, finding these tactical resources, these checkmating ideas, right? And most importantly, being able to show no progress, right? Don't allow your opponent to make progress, especially if you see it, right? Don't allow them to make that necessary progress.